Welcome to the weekly series of Healthcare Scene Google Plus Hangouts, where we sit down with top leaders in healthcare IT. Before we begin, I want to remind those watching live that you can submit your questions on the event page for this Hangout. We'll do our best to answer them during the Hangout. Today we're excited to have Mac McMillan, Chairman, CEO, and co-founder of CynergisTek. For nearly 30 years, he has served as a senior-level positions in both government and industry, responsible for security and risk assessment. And in 2003, he co-founded CynergisTek, whose mission is to make quality IT security consulting available and accessible to organizations across industries and regardless of size or complexity. And on a more personal note, Mac is one of the smartest HIPAA security and privacy people I know. He's just a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really pleased to have him here with me today. Welcome, Mac.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here, and that was quite an intro. Hopefully I'll live up to it.
I'm sure you will. So let's start off. I mean, we're talking HIPAA privacy and security. You know, where are we at today with HIPAA privacy and security?
Well, I think we're a lot better off than we were in 2005, but I think we still have quite a ways to go. We still have a lot of folks that have not, in some cases, have not addressed the basics that allow us to build a good foundation for data protection. More importantly, I think, though, that we have a lot of folks who have not accepted the fact that in healthcare today, with most of our environments being as large and complex as they are, with the data sharing, etc., that goes on, that we're really going to have to invest in various security technologies to really flesh out that security architecture and do the job that we need to do. And then last but not least, I still worry about the smallest healthcare organizations that we have, the physician community, the practice community, the acute care, rural hospitals that we have across America, et cetera. There's a lot of small organizations that don't have a dedicated information security person or privacy person. And there just aren't a lot of great tools out there still for those folks. And quite frankly, you know, with resources being what they are for them, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. It's not something that ONC or OCR or anyone else at HHS isn't aware of. But we have not figured out how to solve that challenge yet.
You bring up two interesting points. The one is maybe the larger organizations. Is it fair to say that they're distracted by meaningful use, by ICD-10, although then now they can ignore that? Or, sorry, I'm sure all the ICD-10 people will hate me for saying that. But, you know, they can put that off a little more. But, you know, I mean, meaningful use was certainly a rushed implementation. Did they not then pay enough attention to privacy and security? Is that a fair assessment, or what are you seeing?
Well, I think it's a fair assessment to say that they're distracted by a lot of things. You know, it's not just meaningful use. It's not just ICD-10. Hospitals today. I mean, if you go in the average large health system today and go to their IT department, you know, nobody's sitting around looking for something to do. I mean, when you look at their project board, if you will, you know, they typically have anywhere from 100 to 150 projects in flight. You know, they're literally at the point where they're trying to figure out which project do I work on, you know, which project has the highest priority, because they can't even get to all of their projects. And I think that's part of the problem. I think part of the problem is a resource issue. Part of the problem is an expertise issue. I think part of it is just it's security, which is not something that adds to the top line, if you will, is competing against a lot of other projects that are designed to bring business in or to enhance what they're doing from a care provision perspective, and those things, you know, they're running into some real challenges, and they're real. They're not. It's not that people are just. I don't think it's because folks are saying I don't care about privacy or I don't care about security. That's not it at all. I think it's a real, you know, they've got a 5-gallon bucket, and they got 10.5 pounds of stuff to go in it, and they're trying to figure out which 5.5 pounds don't end up in the bucket. Sure. And I think that when you look at some of the things that we have to do today in healthcare to really be proficient at security as it relates to monitoring and auditing and whatnot. I think they really need to start looking at other solutions, meaning working with people on the outside to provide additional resources to them, and as well as looking at some managed services around things like monitoring and auditing, because I just don't think they can do it in-house. I mean, very few of our hospitals, for instance, have what we call a SOC, a Security Operations Center, where you have people literally watching what goes on in that environment on a regular basis. And that's really what we're talking about when we start talking about, system monitoring and auditing.
So is really that the solution to the privacy and security problem, is really dedicating someone to that goal, and then you see a significant difference, or is there another solution for these large organizations?
Well, I think that's part of it, because I can tell you that the organizations that we work with where there is a dedicated security professional working in that organization day to day, watching what's going on, paying attention to that program, trying to push forward that security agenda, if you will, right, and make sure that those things are getting done, they tend to be in a much better shape than the organizations that don't have that as a dedicated focus. What's interesting is the last survey that was done by HIMSS, only 50% of our hospitals still today have a dedicated information security professional or a CISO in their organization. And that's just, we're just not there. We're just not making that commitment. So
back to what you said previously too, is that that's what the problem with small organizations is that there's no dedicated professional to that, and like you said, it doesn't add to your bottom line, right? So if you're talking to someone that says, okay, well, this doesn't add to my bottom line, I don't have a dedicated professional, what case would you make for why an organization should dedicate more resources towards this goal?
Well, there's a couple, and I think there are different types of solutions for different organizations, and based on their size and where they're at. The biggest reason I say you need to do this is because while it may not add to your top line, it can definitely detract from your top line. Because if you end up in a situation where, God forbid, you have a breach, or you have an incident, or you have a complaint, which can cost you literally thousands of dollars in cleanup costs and investigative costs and in legal costs in terms of representation, etc. Not to mention if you eventually get a resolution agreement and a fine. And when you look at the operating margins of most of those small organizations, you take a fine of any magnitude whatsoever, or a cost of any magnitude whatsoever, and it absolutely hits the top and the bottom line, right? I mean, it takes profit away right away, and it makes it even harder for them to hit their goals later, because they got to bring in even more revenue on the top line to replace that lost revenue. So there is a financial impact to everybody, no matter what the size, with respect to not doing security smartly. I think where the solution comes in is that smaller organizations, and I when I talk about physician practices a lot of times, I look at physician practices a lot like I look at legal practices, a lot like I look at small local banks, etc. Right? When you look at most of these other professional type organizations that are small like that, they're not trying to do privacy and security themselves. They've outsourced that just like they outsource HR, just like they outsource or payroll, just like they outsource legal, or their accounting, etc. They have a professional organization that manages their network, monitors their systems, etc. And I think for some of the smaller organizations down the road, if they're going to continue to be in this business and deal with the regulatory requirements that we have, I think that's where we've got to migrate to. I mean, if you look at most small banks across America, and I'm talking the small local bank, right? Not the regional player or the big, but the small guy. Most of them, when you walk into them, they've got people in that bank that do banking. Everything else is outsourced to somebody else, right? Their systems are hosted somewhere else. Their security is monitored by somebody else. The whole 9 yards, because they don't have the expertise to do it, and they recognize that. And quite frankly, when you approach that model, a lot of times what you find is that the total cost of doing it that way, a lot of times, is cheaper than trying to do it yourself. Assuming you're trying to do it correctly, right? Now, if you're not trying to do it correctly, then I guess it's cheaper not to do anything. But that's a tremendous risk.
Yeah, I guess there's a balance between quality, right? And there's a lot of doctors who, like one doctor told me they're not going to throw us all in jail, which was a sad example of how many of them approach it.
Yeah, he's right. They're not going to throw all of them in jail, but you don't want to be the one that does get thrown in jail, right? So,
I agree.
Kind of like the Las Vegas method of managing your practice: roll the dice and see what happens.
Well, he certainly seems to have. Although I think that, it's like you said, I think most of them want to be secure and private. That they're just not sure where to go and what to do, and maybe the tools aren't there yet. So.
I agree.
Yeah, so tell us about HIPAA Omnibus, right? It went into effect late last year. Has that really moved the needle in privacy and security, or what impact has that had? It seems like there was a flurry of activity. Oh crap! I better get compliant in November, and now have they forgotten it, or what are you seeing?
No, I think it has moved the needle, and it's moved the needle probably importantly in a couple of areas. The first one is, obviously, it has now brought business associates in line with covered entities, and so that they are now responsible in their own right for what they do and don't do. It has made them liable for the audits. It has made them liable for investigations and for penalties associated with noncompliance.
Mm-hmm.
So it has absolutely raised the bar as it relates to that community. That's not to say that they don't still have a long way to go, because I think we have a lot of business associates out there that are still in a denial phase, which, quite frankly, that should be passed by now. They should have accepted their fate, and they should be starting to do the right things to support the people that they're working for and the information that they're protecting. It also, I think, moved the needle on the enforcement side. I mean, it absolutely changed the formula that OCR follows now with respect to enforcement. They now have the latitude to go directly to a penalty after an investigation, as opposed to offering informal resolution, which was one of the things they had to do in the past. Which means now, if they find evidence of neglect or negligence, they can literally go straight to a resolution or straight to a penalty, and not bother with asking you if you're willing to fix things. The other thing that it's done is it's given them more latitude with respect to the subjective criteria that they now have that they can apply in addition to the chart. You remember, they used to just have the chart that said, if you did X, it costs this much, or it could cost this much, etc. They now have a set of subjective criteria, of course, that says, if somebody is a repeat offender, you can look at them differently. If the breach is particularly egregious, as opposed to something simple, or you can look at them differently. If the breach is a result of somebody being truly negligent or a bad decision or whatever, you can look at that differently than somebody who's trying to do the right thing and just things happen.
Right.
So there's a lot more latitude that they have now, and I think, for instance, when you look at the fine that just came out this week, right? You saw the $4.8 million fine that they just meted out. I think, and from what I understand, and I was back in Washington a week before last for Sue McAndrew's retirement ceremony, and the scuttlebutt or the low talk, if you will, was that there's a lot more coming before they're done. So I think we're going to see a lot more fines coming out here this year, and I think we're going to see more higher dollar value fines coming out. So it's getting serious. I mean, it's one thing to get a $100,000 fine or a $1.5 million fine, but when you start getting fines $5 million and up, hopefully somebody's paying attention.
Yeah, well, I wish they'd pay attention to $1 million, but I think you're right. I think that's what's going to move the needle is these breaches. People see them and say, "Oh, I don't want that to be me," for a number of reasons. And you spoke about business associates. I wrote an article recently. Have there been any breaches of business associates that we've seen? Because they never really post on the HHS wall of shame, this business associate was breached. Is that what it's going to take to wake up the business associates? And do you know of any business associate breaches that I just didn't know about?
Well, there have been several, or there have been several breaches that have been the result of a business associate. So yeah, there's been a number of breaches that have occurred that have involved. If you look at what HHS reports, more than 20% of the breaches that were reported previously involved a business associate in one way or another.
And does the business associate get fined too, or was that before?
And now they will. Now they can, yes. Before they did not. Before Omnibus, they did not. Now they will. So if there is a breach today, if there's a breach after March of last year, and it involves a business associate, OCR can award them a fine, yeah.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting to see once that first business associate fine that hits the $1 million range or somewhere in there, how many of them wake up and say, "Oh, dang, that would kill my business."
Well, that's correct. Especially some of the smaller vendors. Those fines can be very critical. I think too. The other thing that people need to wake up and understand is that the FTC who has just entered the fray this last year. Is very serious about enforcing the Consumer Fraud Act and with respect to promises that organizations make to consumers with respect to privacy and security. And so far, every challenge to their authority to do that has been defeated. So I think it's safe to say that OCR is not the only person you need to be concerned with. The FTC is out there looking for folks as well.
What's an example of something the FTC might come after in healthcare that someone could do wrong and that might be in their crosshairs?
Well, so for instance, when an organization makes a promise, what they call a promise to the consumer. So let's say you put on your website that the consumer can expect that you will protect the confidentiality, availability, and integrity of their data, right?
100% HIPAA compliant or something.
Our solution is HIPAA compliant. It's secure. That's a promise to the consumer, right? You basically told the consumer that your service or your product or whatever meets this criteria that you've expressed to them in a public way. When you fail to do that, when you have a breach, when there is an incident and you fail to protect their information, then you have essentially broached that promise, and that's when the FTC can decide to get involved.
So, speaking to business associates, and it probably applies to, I guess, any covered entity, what's your best advice to them, and what's the process they should go to become HIPAA compliant and make sure that they're good, at least as best they could do? What's your advice?
Well, my first bit of advice is make sure you conduct that risk assessment and do it correctly. We still have a lot of folks that aren't conducting a proper risk assessment or a thorough risk assessment. So make sure you do that. Make sure it's an enterprise-wide risk analysis of your IT environment where EPHI is involved, and identify what those risks are. And then once you've done that, once you've identified what those risks are, make sure that you put a plan in place to address those risks. Nobody expects, and no regulator, quite frankly, expects that you're going to be 100% perfect or that you're never ever going to have a risk out there. What they do expect is that you are managing it, that you are addressing it, that you have a plan for doing that you're aware of what those risks are, and you have some mechanism in place that says we're going to address this, within a certain period of time or in a certain manner. The other thing is make sure that you have all of your policies and procedures documented. Make sure that you have your program documented well enough that when that regulator comes in and says, I want to see your policies, I want to see your training, I want to see your risk analysis, et cetera, that you can actually produce that stuff. And so from a compliance perspective, really it comes down to documentation of your program, education of your workforce, conducting that risk analysis, and having a plan in place and a program in place to remediate the things that you've identified in your environment. It's not about being 100% secure. It's about working towards getting secure and meeting the requirements.
Nice. And it's interesting. You go back to the risk assessment, which was a requirement for meaningful use. I imagine you're still running into people over and over who attested that they did a risk assessment and still need one. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I think we're seeing less of that now because of the effort of our good friends over at Figliozzi and Company working for CMS. I think everybody has figured out now. They've heard from peers and others in the industry that you cannot pay lip service to these requirements anymore. You can't just go on that site and check the boxes and say you've done it and not do it, because you can be audited. It could be as simple as a desk audit, but it could also be as invasive as that organization sending 3 or 4 people on site to verify everything that you said you did, plus all of the numbers that you provided in your calculations. So, and we've also now seen at the beginning of this year, they are now beginning to do prepayment audits. So basically an organization attests, Figliozzi and then get charged with going to that organization and auditing them before they get their payment. So it's, if you're this is one of those times where if you're using the Las Vegas method of compliance, really a risky proposition. And the problem with this risky proposition is we're not talking about HIPAA compliance here. We're talking about Medicare, Medicaid payment program, incentive program. So you're talking about fraud, right? When you attest that you have done that risk analysis as part of your attestation process, or that your numbers are correct that you've collected as part of that attestation process, and that in fact is not true, then you've made a false statement and you've committed fraud for the purpose of getting a payment. That's a whole different set of laws that come into play with respect to that than what we see on the HIPAA compliance side.
Because they faked a risk assessment. That's interesting. I'd love to, in our last 5 minutes that we have here, I'd love to talk more about the HIPAA audits. Do meaningful use audits often lead to HIPAA audits, or are they separate, or what are you seeing with HIPAA audits? Yeah,
no, they're not connected at all, John. They are totally separate programs. One run by CMS, the other run by OCR.
I don't have a referral thing that says, "Hey, you might want to check these people out."
not that I know of. I'll put it that way.
If it was a business, it would. But okay, go ahead.
but on the OCR audit front, obviously the pilots were back in 2012. They took some time off to collect their thoughts around those audits and to get feedback from the people who went through those audits, and to work on that process some more. They actually did some things that I thought were very needed in terms of improving their process. They've hired professional security people and professional auditors on the OCR staff now. So it's not just the lawyers that are running this program. You now have professional security and audit folks who are going to be running these audits and supporting the investigations and the complaint reviews. And the audits that they're going to, the audit program, as you know, is going to start back up again in October of this year. The permanent audit program. It's going to be an audit program that they run internally with their own assets. So it'll be government people conducting those audits. They are, they've sent out the surveys to the 800 covered entities to collect information from them with respect to who might potentially end up on the list for audit for next year. From that list, they're also learning about the business associates that are associated with those covered entities, and they are then going to send out surveys to 400 of them. Once they have sent out all 1,200 surveys this summer and gotten the results back, that will then be used as the list of organizations that they choose from or select from for the audits starting in October. And if you listen to what Leon has said, even though he's about to depart, the audits are about to take on a different feel for folks, and may lead to action as opposed to just an audit report.
So previously it was basically, here's what you did wrong, but now it could lead to the fines and things that we talked about?
Exactly. I think during the pilot year, from my discussions with them and what they've said to others, they looked at the pilot year as a year of learning, right? A year of perfecting the process, a year of collecting information and data, a year of retrospection in terms of looking back and figuring out what makes sense going forward. But now that they've done that, I think those audits will be more meaningful.
I imagine it was also a year to help the covered entities know this is our expectation and you're not living up to it, so correct it, right? So what did they find that, that in the future audits they may say, we told you about this, why didn't you do it? Are there things that were found in those first HIPAA audits that we should learn from?
Oh, absolutely, and there's been numerous presentations made. I mean, the things that were learned in those first audits, quite frankly, are too numerous to list. But one of them, just right off the top of my head, one of them is the risk analysis requirement, right? They found in those first audits that organizations weren't performing risk assessment. Organizations weren't performing risk assessment frequently enough. Organizations weren't performing thorough risk assessments or performing them correctly. And organizations didn't have good plans for remediating the items that they identified during those risk assessments. So that's just one example. I mean, there are all kinds of examples, from encryption to auditing to business associates to destruction and disposal of equipment and data. There were a number of findings that came out of those, and there's you can go on the OCR website and other places, and you can find multiple presentations that talk about the things that they found and what organizations need to be aware of.
Excellent. It sounds like it's a lot of the things that we hear over and over again, and some people, I guess, just aren't doing it. So, any final thoughts about HIPAA? Any suggestions for people dealing with this in their organization before we wrap up?
I think as a final thought, if you haven't taken it seriously yet or gotten on with it, you need to do that. I think that I think based on some of the things that we've seen lately and some of the rhetoric, I think that some of the patience, if you will, in Washington has run out, and I think things are going to be taken a lot more seriously now in terms of incidents and whatnot that might occur. And you just don't want to throw good money after bad in those kinds of situations. It just doesn't do anything positive for the industry or for your system. So a little bit of prevention goes a hell of a long way towards avoiding a bad event. So I'd say go out, get it done. And for God's sake, if you got mobile devices out there and laptops, etc., encrypt them.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you shouldn't have to say it at this point, but we still have folks that lose laptops or have laptops stolen, and have to admit that there was data on those laptops and that they weren't encrypted.
Yep, embarrassing. Well, thank you so much for spending this time. It's been a good look at where we're at, and I appreciate your insight. I'm sure that many watching at home live and on the recording after will very much appreciate it.
I appreciate it, John, anytime, and thanks for giving me something to do on vacation here.
Thanks a lot. We'll have to have you back again.
All right, John.